On November 18, 1803, French troops were defending one of their last major positions in Saint-Domingue. Napoleon had sent a massive expedition across the Atlantic to restore French control over the richest colony in the Caribbean. At first, it had seemed to work. Toussaint Louverture, the most powerful leader in the colony, had surrendered. French forces occupied the main towns. Thousands of local soldiers had returned to French service. Yet now, less than 2 years later, the expedition was collapsing. Across from the French position at Vertières stood an army led by men who had once lived under slavery. Jean-Jacques Dessalines commanded the final campaign. Henri Christophe held an important sector. Alexandre Pétion and other officers who had once fought rival political wars were now part of the same struggle. By the end of the battle, the French position was no longer sustainable. Within weeks, the surviving expedition would evacuate. And on January 1st, 1804, the colony France had once called Saint-Domingue would declare itself Haiti. But the strangest part is that France had appeared to win this war more than a year earlier. To understand how that victory became catastrophe, we have to return to the society Napoleon was trying to reclaim. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue was one of the most profitable colonies in the Atlantic world. Sugar and coffee plantations generated extraordinary wealth for France and for merchants tied to the colonial trade. That wealth rested on slavery. The enslaved population vastly outnumbered the white population, and the plantation system consumed human lives so quickly that slave traders continually brought new captives from Africa. The colony was wealthy because violence had been turned into an economic system. It was also politically divided. Large white planters wanted wealth and sometimes greater autonomy from France. Poorer whites defended racial privilege. Free people of color, many of whom owned property and some of whom owned slaves themselves, demanded political rights denied to them because of race. And beneath all of those conflicts were hundreds of thousands of enslaved people, with the most fundamental demand of all: freedom. Before we continue, my name is Noah. We built this channel for people who want the full story behind the revolutions, wars, and turning points that changed the world. If that sounds like you, subscribe. It is free, and it helps us make better videos more than you might think. All right, back to Saint-Domingue. Then the French Revolution reached the Caribbean. The language of liberty and equality created a question the colonial system could not answer. If rights belonged to men, who counted as a man? In August 1791, a massive uprising began in northern Saint-Domingue. Plantations burned, enslaved workers armed themselves, colonial authority fractured. The uprising survived because it was not a single army that could be defeated once and disbanded. Groups operated across plantation districts, recruited new fighters, used knowledge of the terrain, and forced every outside power to negotiate with people the colonial system had treated as property. But this was not yet one united Haitian independence movement. Some insurgents negotiated for improved conditions rather than complete abolition. Some fought alongside Spain, which controlled the eastern part of Hispaniola. Britain invaded parts of the colony. French Republicans, Royalists, free people of color, plantation owners, and different black commanders formed alliances that could change with the political situation. One man learned how to survive inside that chaos better than almost anyone. Toussaint Louverture had been enslaved earlier in his life and was already a free man when the revolution began. He rose among the black insurgent forces and initially aligned with Spain against revolutionary France. Then, France changed the rules. In 1793, French commissioners in Saint-Domingue began proclaiming emancipation. In February 1794, the National Convention in Paris abolished slavery throughout the French colonies. Toussaint changed sides and joined the French Republic. That decision was both ideological and strategic. Spain had not offered the same clear guarantee of universal emancipation. Britain, wherever it restored plantation control, represented another threat to freedom. That switch changed everything. Toussaint was no longer merely surviving the revolution. He was now rising through the army of the very republic that had abolished the system he had once lived under. Over the next several years, French Republican forces and their local allies pushed Spain and Britain out of the struggle for Saint-Domingue. Toussaint became commander-in-chief. He then defeated André Rigaud, a powerful free-colored leader in the South, during a bitter internal conflict remembered as the War of Knives. By 1801, Toussaint controlled almost the entire island. He occupied the former Spanish colony in the east and abolished slavery there. Then he issued a constitution. Saint-Domingue remained formally connected to France, but Toussaint made himself governor for life and gave the colony enormous autonomy. He had not declared Haitian independence, but he had created a political order that Napoleon was unlikely to accept. By 1801, Toussaint looked almost untouchable. He had survived slavery, civil war, Spanish intervention, British invasion, political rivals, and constant changes in government in France. Then Napoleon sent an army across the Atlantic, and not a small one. The expedition, commanded by General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, brought tens of thousands of troops and was reinforced as the campaign continued. Its mission was to restore firm French authority. Napoleon had chosen his moment carefully. A temporary peace with Britain made a large Atlantic expedition possible, and Leclerc arrived with enough force to attack several centers at once. He also used politics. French proclamations insisted that liberty would be respected, giving black officers a reason to negotiate rather than fight to destruction. That promise mattered because many of them still considered themselves French citizens defending emancipation, not founders of a separate nation. It also formed part of Napoleon's larger attempt to rebuild French power in the Americas. Saint-Domingue was supposed to become the economic center of that system, while France still possessed the enormous Louisiana Territory on the North American mainland. Toussaint understood the danger. When the French arrived in early 1802, local commanders resisted in several places. Christophe ordered Cap Français burned rather than handed intact to the expedition. The campaign became brutal. At Crête-à-Pierrot, Haitian defenders held a fortified position against repeated French attacks before eventually breaking out. But Leclerc had advantages. His army contained experienced veterans. French forces controlled major ports. Some local commanders believed Napoleon's promises that freedom would be respected. And disease had not yet reached its most destructive phase. One by one, important leaders submitted. Christophe came over. Dessalines came over. Toussaint finally agreed to retire to his estate. By the summer of 1802, Napoleon's expedition appeared to have succeeded. Toussaint had surrendered. Then French officers arrested him. He was placed aboard a ship and deported to France, where he would die in a mountain prison the following year. If the story ended here, Napoleon had won. Instead, this is where France began losing Saint-Domingue. The first problem was biological. French soldiers arriving from Europe had little immunity to yellow fever. As the rainy season intensified, mosquitoes spread disease through the expedition. Units that had survived combat began disappearing without a battle. Hospitals filled. Officers died. Replacements arrived and became sick in turn. Yellow fever was devastating. But yellow fever alone did not create Haiti. A sick army could still hold ports and strongpoints if the population around it remained divided and enough local forces accepted French rule. France's next decisions made that increasingly impossible. In 1802, Napoleon's government restored slavery in colonies where abolition had not effectively taken permanent hold, and French forces violently reimposed slavery in Guadeloupe. News traveled. In Saint-Domingue, People who had been told that their freedom would be protected now had evidence that French policy could move in the opposite direction. French commanders also began trying to disarm black troops and reassert tighter control. The fear was no longer abstract. Lose the political struggle, and slavery might return. That changed the war. The French had captured Toussaint. Then they gave Toussaint's former generals a reason to believe that submission itself was dangerous. Dessalines returned to rebellion. Christophe returned to rebellion. Pétion joined the anti-French struggle. The coalition was still complicated, and old rivalries did not vanish. But leaders who had spent years fighting one another now had a common enemy and a common reason not to trust French guarantees. Meanwhile, Leclerc was dying. Yellow fever killed him in November 1802. His replacement, Donatien de Rochambeau, responded to the insurgency with increasingly extreme terror. Executions, drownings, and other atrocities were intended to frighten resistance into submission. They helped convince opponents that there was little room left for compromise. Violence escalated on both sides, and the final struggle became extraordinarily brutal. This is the real midpoint reversal. At the beginning of 1802, France possessed the stronger conventional army and could still exploit divisions among local commanders. By the beginning of 1803, disease had destroyed much of that army. French policy had reunited important enemies, and terror was making surrender less attractive than continued war. Then the international situation turned against Napoleon too. In May 1803, war resumed between France and Britain. The Royal Navy could now attack French shipping and restrict reinforcement and resupply across the Atlantic. Saint-Domingue was becoming a military trap. French troops needed men, ammunition, medicine, and food from across an ocean increasingly controlled by their enemy. Dessalines' forces needed to survive long enough to keep the trap closed. And they did. The campaign shifted steadily against the French. Local forces could operate inland, avoid battles that favored European formations, attack isolated positions, and return as French garrisons weakened. By then, Napoleon's wider American strategy was collapsing as well. Without secure control of Saint-Domingue, Louisiana was far less useful as the centerpiece of a French-American empire. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803. One of the largest land transfers in history was tied, in part, to a revolution France could not suppress in the Caribbean. By the second half of 1803, Dessalines was no longer fighting simply to preserve emancipation inside the French Empire. The objective had moved toward independence. French positions fell one after another. And that brings us back to Vertières. On November 18th, Haitian forces attacked the French defenses near Cap Français. The battle was hard-fought, and the French defenders resisted effectively. But battlefield courage could no longer reverse the strategic situation. Rochambeau's army had been devastated by disease. Reinforcement across the Atlantic had become far more difficult. The countryside was hostile. The insurgent coalition was stronger, and British naval power threatened the remaining route of escape. After Vertières, the French negotiated evacuation. Napoleon's attempt to restore Saint-Domingue had failed. On January 1st, 1804, Dessalines and other leaders declared independence at Gonaives. They revived the name Haiti. The new state was born from a revolution that had destroyed legal slavery and defeated attempts by several outside powers to control the colony. It was an achievement without a close parallel in the Atlantic world. For slaveholding societies across the Americas, Haiti was terrifying proof that an enslaved population could destroy a plantation regime and build a sovereign state. For abolitionists and black communities elsewhere, it became proof of something very different. Slavery was not permanent, and European empires were not unbeatable. But independence did not produce a peaceful ending. The new country faced diplomatic isolation from slaveholding powers, terrified by what the revolution represented. In 1804, Dessalines ordered the killing of many of the remaining French white residents. The massacre was an atrocity and part of the revolution's violent aftermath, even as the new state defined itself against the possibility of renewed French domination. Toussaint never saw any of this. He died at Fort de Joux in France in April 1803, months before Vertières. Dessalines would become Haiti's first ruler and later declared himself emperor. Christophe and Pétion would eventually become rivals again. And France refused to recognize Haitian independence for decades. In 1825, recognition came only after Haiti accepted a crushing indemnity to compensate former French colonists, including former slaveholders. The military victory had ended colonial rule. The economic struggle with the former colonial power continued for generations. So how did Haiti defeat Napoleon? Not with one man, not with one battle, and not with yellow fever alone. Toussaint helped build a disciplined political and military order out of a revolution that had begun with many competing factions. French emancipation made freedom something people had already experienced, not merely something they hoped to gain. Napoleon's expedition initially exploited divisions and defeated Toussaint politically and militarily. Disease then devastated the French army, but people still had to continue resisting the soldiers who survived. The restoration of slavery elsewhere in the French Caribbean made French promises harder to trust. Attempts to disarm local troops and the brutality of the final French command helped turn former collaborators back into enemies. Dessalines, Christophe, Pétion, and thousands of soldiers kept the war alive. Britain's return to war isolated the expedition by sea. Napoleon's wider American project lost its foundation. And when France appeared closest to victory, its own policies helped create the coalition that finished the war. That is the central contradiction. Napoleon sent overwhelming force to restore an empire. But the stronger France made the threat of restored slavery appear, the more powerful the resistance became. Disease weakened the French army. British sea power isolated it. French brutality united enemies. But none of those forces could declare independence. People on the ground still had to defeat the army that remained. And they did. On January 1st, 1804, France's richest Caribbean colony became Haiti, a state born from the only successful, large-scale slave revolution in history to create a lasting independent nation.